Imperial Saints. Or greater demons of the God Emperor if you're feeling spicy, as they certainly bear one or two striking similarities to the servants of the arch-enemy, though simply calling them greater demons of the Emperor is too simplistic of an interpretation, as the Saints very clearly operate by an entirely different rule set, as demonstrated by the fact, for example, that they can exist within a regular reality without constant access to the warp. But first, a word from our sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends, the enormous dungeon-delving strategy game with 15 factions. Everything from dwarves to barbarians to sacred orders. All at your command to conquer 12 massive dungeons and the PvP arena, which recently introduced live player versus player combat in one of the many regular content updates, which also recently introduced the Phantom Shogun boss as well. Available, of course, on mobile and desktop devices. So maybe you should give it a look, because after all, surely 400 million players worldwide can't be wrong. And if you still need further persuasion, why not check out the brand new boss, Akumori the Phantom Shogun, which gives you the resources required to upgrade your artifacts to make an even more efficient dungeon diving machine, or the now completed 10-episode custom limited animation Call of the Arbiter, available on Raid's official YouTube channel and from in-game. So check it out today, either by scanning the QR code visible on screen or by clicking the link in the description below, and new players will get access to all of this cool in-game loot as well, which you will find right here in your inbox. So then, Imperial Saints. Before we get to the whole explanation as to why they can bounce bullets off their foreheads, or slice a bloodthirster in half with a single swipe of a perfectly manicured finger, let us get into some definitions first, as there are some valuable distinctions to be made between, well, different types of Imperial Saints. The one you are all probably most familiar with is the Living Saint, usually a sister of battle that has ascended to become the ultimate avatar of the God Emperor. This is also where a lot of the whole greater demon of Big E comes into play, as sisters of battle that has reached this elevated state of being tend to be pretty goddamn devastating on the battlefield. Unfortunately for the Imperium, and much to the chagrin of the ecclesiarchy, however, this sort of saint is vastly outnumbered, by quite some order of magnitude, by the other type of Imperial saint. The non-living one. The dead saints. Yes, tragically, much like in reality, the martyrs outnumber the saints by a fair old degree. Now, all that is technically required for somebody to become a saint, at least of the dead variant, is to be declared as such by the ecclesiarchy, whereas becoming a saint of the living variant requires an intervention of an altogether greater power. But before we start wandering aimlessly off into the fields of mysticism, let us speak of the horizontally inclined saints first. As mentioned, the most usual way of becoming an Imperial Saint is to be pronounced as one by the ecclesiarchy. This can be in response to a great deed, or simply a long life lived in tremendous service of the God Emperor. Obviously, seeing as it is the cult of the Emperor that awards the title, the services rendered or the achievements made tend to be of a religious nature. But in a society like the Imperium, of course, where the religious and the personal are intertwined, what exactly constitutes a religious deed can vary somewhat. For example, the title of saint is often awarded to military commanders for conquering new worlds in the name of the emperor, or reclaiming old ones from their not-so-holy occupants. Other saints, like Philodas, for example, was awarded his title for settling a planet. A conquest of sorts, but obviously not of a military nature. Other great feats can also be awarded with the title, like Saint Steinus, who was awarded it after penning his 38th volume of the Ecclesiarchy Dogmatics, a sizable collection of religious works, cut tragically short from the planned 40th volume, of course, by, well, the tyrannid eating him. It happens to the best of us. And speaking of being eaten, there are also acts that seem impossible or implausible that are also awarded with the title of saint, like Uther the Cataplast, who took 99 wounds over the course of his life, with the 99th finally being the one which put him out of his, at this point, no doubt significant misery. You might also be noticing a bit of a pattern at this point, as indeed the majority of sainthoods are awarded posthumously. Quite a while posthumously, actually, in most cases, as it needs quite a lot of investigation to decide upon whether or not someone is worthy of sainthood. Normally, the ecclesiarchy will go through an extensive period of ensuring that the person's credentials are impeccable, and that their opinions cannot damage the ecclesiarchy in any way. As this is, of course, one of the potential dangers of declaring someone to be an avatar of your religion. They will, unsurprisingly, be considered to be quite the authority on the matter. And seeing as all religions are in essence open to a great deal of interpretation, the Imperial cult being no exception to this rule, somebody who has, alternative viewpoints could be very dangerous to the established order of the ecclesiarchy. This is why some honest God Emperor saints have been canonized, in the literal sense via heavy artillery, rather than in the theological sense. This too is yet another benefit with awarding sainthood posthumously, because even if you discover later that the person in question might have had an improper relationship with his servitors, or pets for that matter, well, that's history now. The guy's dead after all, and history is malleable. Very, very malleable, particularly in a universe like the 41st millennium. And even if the person in question had committed certain indiscretions in the past, these can be covered up relatively easily. With a living saint, however, all of this gets infinitely more complicated, because not only do you have to deal with the fact that he might say something uncouth, truly, but you also have to deal with the fact that they might be blackmailed, or have their past used against them, or they might even object to having their past erased for some moral or ethical concerns. You know, the whole living saint thing tends to give people a bit of an intense desire for a tall horse to perch upon. This, frankly, somewhat inevitable sense of self-righteousness, I mean, they are a saint after all, also has a nasty habit of leading people to develop ideas beyond their station, and figure that, well, I'm the literal saint, so I guess I'm right, and everybody else is wrong. And the Imperium has had more than enough of a problem with apostates already, thank you, to invite that problem into its midst again. To put it somewhat more bluntly and briefly, dead martyr, good, beneficial propaganda poster, living saint, whole heaping hemp bag full of potential problems. Now, in our world, of course, this isn't usually too much of a problem. You can always just, kill them. if you really need to fix the problem, or make sure that they are dead before you canonize them. But in the 41st millennium, there is a little bit of an issue with this, as you see, there is another way to become a saint, and that is to die, and then come back again, usually surrounded by an enormous glowing golden halo. Because, as a matter of fact, most living saints, as in currently alive and kicking saints, were once dead saints, and then were live again, living saints. Confusing, I know. But as it turns out, when divine power, actual, genuine, honest-to-God, it exists divine power, is at play, well, being deceased can, on occasions, be merely a mild hindrance or a temporary discomfort. Luckily for the ecclesiarchy, this is exceedingly rare, however, as considering how many people die in the Imperium every single solitary day, even if you had something like a 0.1% resurrecting turning into a saint thing, the Imperium would be awash with immortal super soldiers, which would be a good thing on the one hand and be a nightmare for the ecclesiarchy's internal cohesion on the other. Rather, living saints are usually people of extraordinary power. Mental power? Warp power? Well, that's where things get a little bit complicated, as the majority of living saints are, of course, of the Sisters of Battle variety. You know, the giant floating woman with eagle wings type. This is also good for the ecclesiarchy because the Sisters of Battle by and large knows how and when to fall in line. They have been drilled with the dogmas of the ecclesiarchy for their entire lives and are therefore pretty damn unlikely to suddenly go rogue and declare a brand new interpretation of the Imperial cult. In no small part because Adepta Sororitas living saints are, by and large, preoccupied with carrying out interstellar genocides against heretics and Xenos monstrosities. Now, even your average bolter bitch is of course capable of committing some pretty damn impressive acts of violence, but a living saint version of a bolter bitch is so much more than that. First and foremost, she's basically immune to damage in many cases. There are examples of living saints where bullets just kind of bounce off them. Others seem to have force fields that stop the rounds dead in the air. Some can burn heretics to crisps just by looking at them. Others are equipped with meters-long enormous swords, blazing with holy lights, and so on and so on. Many of them even have powers that seem downright magical or psychic in nature. And this is, of course, where we get to the whole greater demons of the Emperor thing. Because, well, I mean, it kinda looks like it, doesn't it? You've got an individual that is granted tremendous power and becomes a sort of an avatar for a deity, as it appears, and they can suddenly wield all kinds of insane powers, and possess remarkable strength and endurance, and indeed the ability to resurrect themselves. There are some saints that have been resurrected after centuries. There are some saints that, when killed, come right back. And there are other saints who don't seem to possess this power at all. And there are others that seem to possess some powers that other saints do not. And other saints that seem to possess almost no powers. Or at the very least not in comparison to the enormous winged woman saint. There's a lot of inconsistencies here, but perhaps the largest one of all, and the one most likely to sweep the legs underneath the whole greater demon of the God Emperor thing, is the very first Imperial saint, Euphrati Keeler. Those of you who have read the Horus Heresy will no doubt recognize that name, and you may then also remember that she was able to banish demons with holy power long before Big E actually placed his shiny ass upon that throne of his. So how did she do it? Because, of course, the whole greater demon of the Emperor idea comes from the thinking that in the warp, things that people believe in become real. And considering the billions, trillions, zillions of people that believe in the Emperor, it seems entirely logical that there is some kind of God-Emperor entity somewhere in the warp. And there are several outright miracles created by what appears to be the Emperor in defense of the Imperium. There are miraculous moments that cannot be explained by normal mundane means. There are appearances of angels, and occasionally space marines on fire, and of course the living saints themselves. There clearly is something to the idea that the God Emperor is intervening in the world of the 41st millennium, though the question as to whether or not that is the God Emperor, as in the guy on the throne, or the God Emperor, the warp entity, is very unclear. However, at this point in time, when Euphrati Keeler first sees off a demon using a holy image of an Aquila to do so, the God Emperor was not a warp entity, because he was believed in by a few 100,000, at most probably, maybe a couple millions, throughout the Imperium, the secret Imperial cult. So it is very unlikely he would have that kind of power. Nor was Big E himself on the throne, so his own innate psychic powers would not yet have been elevated to the incredible levels of the Astronomicon. So if the God Emperor, the warp entity, didn't intervene, and the God Emperor, the actual Emperor, didn't intervene, who did? Well, that is a question we don't actually have the answer to. A question that even Malkador the Situlite found so interesting that once the heresy started rolling properly, he freed Euphrati Keeler from imprisonment by the Sisters of Silence. As the original leading theory, of course, was that she was a Psyker. Done deal, okay. She uses weird magical powers to do stuff that we can't explain. Well, we do have an explanation for that. It's called psychic powers. But despite all of her time on Luna in the Sisters' prison, well, one, Euphrati didn't go bonkers batshit, which is next to impossible for any Psyker surrounded by null sisters all the time, and secondly, her powers appeared to be genuinely non-psychic in nature, leading Malkador to eventually free her so that he could study her. Not in the dice her up and dissect her, we hope, but in the monitoring her sense, the reading her, the probing her mind sense. As her supernatural powers, for that is what they appeared to be, were clearly real. She'd used them on multiple occasions with tons of witnesses, and yet no scientific, including warp scientific, explanation could actually be found for those powers. And in the end, as far as we know, Malkador never arrived at a conclusion before his untimely death, and as to what happened afterwards, again, we don't know, but seeing as Euphrati Keeler was eventually declared a full-on Imperial saint and recognized by the Imperium, clearly she must have remained in decent standing with the power structures that be, as, of course, the Imperial cult did not rise to complete dominance just overnight immediately. It actually took them hundreds, if not thousands of years to arrive at a position of true prominence within the Imperium, because, bearing in mind, once again, what preceded the Imperial cult was the Imperial truth, where Big E himself vehemently denied his divinity. But for the sake of a bit of good old-fashioned speculation, what possible explanation could there be for a saint using, apparently, holy powers before the God Emperor's ascension? Well, Big E had already been in the warp, and from what we know of his time in the warp, he must have done something pretty radical in there, because he emerged with a hell of a lot more power and a hell of a lot more knowledge. It is possible that some sort of imprint of the God Emperor remained within the warp that somehow created a warp entity, Big E, before Big E became, Big E, etc. That's possible. Alternatively, she might have been a different kind of Psyker. Something along the lines of a blank, for example, that was only capable of channeling a very specific type of energy. And what I'm referring to here is, she might have been an orc. No, I'm serious. Not as in green, you know, but the orcs do the absurd and gravity and physics-defying things that they do because they believe they can do them. And this is because their entire species has been biologically programmed to use the warp as a tool. The reason why red vehicles do in fact go faster is because all of the orcs, anywhere, everywhere, believe that red vehicles go faster. The reason why their roughshod tanks don't fall apart immediately is because the orcs don't believe they will fall apart. This kind of shaping of the warp was something that was quite common in the Old One's creations. Like the Eldar, for example, also used the deities of the warp for the most mundane thing, like keeping their goddamn houses standing. It is therefore conceivable that this comes from some sort of mindset, or mental manipulation, or particular way of believing, heavens alone knows, and it's therefore theoretically conceivable that euphrati keeler's faith, in combination with some natural biological mutation, or even perhaps a deliberate one, created a singular creature capable of tapping into the warp and manifesting what she believed to be miracles with the abilities that she believed those miracles would have in reality, without actually creating a warp entity necessarily. She creates more of a very specific purpose entity. Because bear you in mind as well, the entire idea that a religious artifact of the God Emperor can drive away demons, of course requires you to think that demons exist, because again, the warp only does what you believe it does. If a sufficient quantity of people believe that holy iconography drive away demons, then they'll drive away demons. But if they don't, they'll have absolutely no effect. So the fact that a religious icon made from, what was it, a discarded bolter shell, I think it was, would have the power to repel an honest-to-God demon from reality, indicates that her powers were far more fully formed, shall we say, as an entire religious school and doctrine and way of thinking, than merely just, ugly thing, go away. If you get my drift. Now, of course, we could also simply explain this with good old-fashioned writeritis, in that the authors of the book figured, okay, alright, I've got this idea of her as a saint and the first Imperial saint and stuff, and, like, go away, demon, begone, and adding some questions as to what the Emperor was doing and whether or not he was truly divine or trying to be divine, etc. So I'm just gonna write in that this is what happened, regardless of any actual justification of it, but that's a boring explanation. However, the fact remains that we can't really draw too much in the way of a conclusion from euphrati keeler's rather unique case. So let's return to the winged women of the Sisters of Battle. These living saints are, well, it's quite tempting, again, to call them greater demons of the God Emperor, because they are amongst his most devout servants, obviously. They are amongst his warriors as well, that go into battle with his name on their lips. And when they transform, they pretty much just keep doing what they've been doing up until that point, murdering tremendous quantities of heretics, as that seems to become their overriding raison d'etre. However, again, we have several rules that demons are bound by that do not affect the greater demons of the Emperor, which is why, again, I think it is a cool term, but misleading and incorrect. First and foremost, and the biggest one, is that demons require access to the warp to remain in the immaterial realm. And this goes for demon princes as well, incidentally. We know for a fact, for example, that even Angron, a demon primarch, needed to construct various temples and monoliths to retain his power in the real world, and to continue to receive the aid of his patron deity in the form of his demons. Whereas the living saints appear to have no such restrictions whatsoever. They don't need to be near some warp rift, they don't seem to be causing any, nor do they seem to need psychic support, which indicates that their powers aren't directly warp-based if drawn from the warp at all. Now, yet again, we can kind of look at euphrati keeler and wonder if faith doesn't have some sort of a different mechanic than the demons, but again, we kind of end up in a bit of a circular argument because of the demons, of course, also use faith and religion to convince people to summon them. They convince people to believe in them. They enjoy it when people call them demons, because that gives them power. They too feed off faith. Perhaps even that's the difference. A demon feeds off faith, but doesn't necessarily need faith. So long as the demon knows that it's being believed in, it doesn't really care if it's because of a religious reason, or out of fear, or out of whatever, really. We could know the demons existed because of cereal boxes, for all the demons care. All they care about is that we know they exist, and preferably that we're very, 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 very afraid of them. Whereas the living saints, well, there doesn't appear to be any indication that they feed off fear, like the demons do. There is no clear indication they grow more powerful the more others suffer, like the demons do, unless there is some sort of a reverse mechanic here, like the warp has mirrored itself, so that instead of not really needing faith, but it's a valuable tool, the saints are directly fueled by faith. And instead of feeding off pain of anything, they feed off righteous wrath, anger, suffering perhaps of heretics and demons. It's an interesting theoretical, but again, it doesn't explain where their powers come from. We could then argue that their power comes directly from the God Emperor, which is feasible, sort of, I suppose. He is the single most powerful human psyker in the entirety of the universe's history. Would it be beyond the pale that he could perhaps imbue a chosen human with a fraction of this power, boosted as it is by the Golden Throne? Probably not. I mean, the Eldar do something sort of kinda pseudo in a way similar with the Avatar of Cain, which also, of course, does not require a stable warp portal to maintain it. Instead, the spirit of keeler Mensha Cain is bound into a form of living metal. If anything, I do indeed believe that comparing the living saints to an avatar is more correct than to a demon, as they clearly exist using some sort of a different idea of the warp, though even then the Avatar of Cain is bound to the warp by the fact that it is keeler Mensha Cain, the Eldar god. Not to mention the whole thing about a human sacrifice being required to actually summon him also. Whereas the living saints seem to exist entirely outside of the rules of the warp. So, the Emperor theory is a possible one. I mean, again, most powerful psychic ever, he could probably pull off some pretty fancy magic tricks. Or, alternatively, we have a warp entity that, due to the warp's own regulations, acts in opposition to it because it's the warp. I know, roundabout, but the warp functions based on certain rules. Fair enough. These rules appear to be fairly ironclad. Fair enough. But at the same time, the nature of the warp is ever-changing. So, yet again, how can we be sure that those rules are actually absolutes, rather than simply rules imposed upon the warp by the warp itself? And if that's the case, then an entity that functions outside of the warp's norms might actually be inevitable, as its very nature is constant flux. I like this one less than the psychic power of the God Emperor thing, honestly, because the thing is, the warp does appear to function based on fairly ironclad rules, and there are very few, if any, real exceptions to those rules, to the point that even the Old Ones and the Eldar weren't able to invent a warp entity that was beyond the rules of the warp. They always needed to guide the warp into it. And thus, because these absolute rules exists, to say that an entity exists outside of those rules would be like saying we discovered a human that doesn't need oxygen or water or food, for example. It would be a literal impossibility. One would think anyways, but again, warp fuckery. It can do a lot of fancy shit too. Another, third theory, is also that the Saints are, well, Psykers, but of a variant not very common and perhaps even completely unknown to the Imperium or the other species, in that they use their psychic powers to give themselves the powers they have, including the power of resurrection as well. But instead of these psychic powers manifesting in the usual ways, they are instead some form of hyper-stable but hyper-rare mutation, a la the same line as blanks, for example. Now, again, you would imagine that the Imperium would have been able to nail this down at some point, seeing as it's not that the Imperium is completely technologically stagnant. They do have advancements, and they do try to look into things, and after 10,000 years, you'd figure they might have discovered some sort of a pattern at some point. But on the other hand, the only reason we know blanks exist is because we can positively identify the phenomena of their existence, e.g., a blank appears, this is what happens when a blank appears, and these are the rules surrounding a blank. Fair enough. Whereas a living saint, are there enough of them to establish a true pattern? And if there is a pattern, has anyone bothered to connect the dots? In fact, this could even potentially provide an explanation for Euphrati Keeler, in that she was a Psyker, but a completely different kind of Psyker that no one had ever seen before. It's an appealing theory, based on absolutely nothing but sheer undiluted speculation, mind you, with no real precedence beyond the blank's existence, I suppose, at all, but bearing in mind that every single Psyker, in lore anyways, has different powers, it's far from impossible. Unlike in the actual gameplay, where every Psyker simply fires lightning from his goddamn fingertips. Though there's even a little bit of a caveat here as well, namely that some saints seem to completely ignore the laws of the physics and reality entirely. Saint Celestine, for example, simply just kind of appeared in Cadia during Abaddon's 13th Grand Temper Tantrum. Nobody knew she was there, she didn't appear to have traveled there in any way, she was just like, hey, I'm here, because you know, it looks like you're having a bit of a tough time, which suggests that she might have the ability to, well, actually, literally, teleport across unimaginably vast distances of space, or that she is capable of simply manifesting into reality when and wherever it, well, seems reasonable to do so. Though in this particular instance, I do feel like perhaps a writer-itis might be the most likely explanation for her teleportation abilities. As, again, living saints are intended to be, meant to be, should be, are absolutely the embodiment of the Emperor's might and rules and laws, an imperial cult in the 41st millennium. In other words, they are the most zealous zealots to have ever zealoted. And yet, Saint Celestine, of course, as we rather famously know now from the Gathering Storm, decided to ally with Eldar, in fact an Eldar witch as well, Ynnari, to travel to Macragge and then resurrect Guilliman using Eldar magic. Supported by the Black Templars, incidentally. One would think that an avatar of the Imperial cult would cast one glance at an Eldar witch and simply go, burn! But in this case, apparently not. Hardly the only major plot hole in the Gathering Storm, but oh well. And, honestly, the Saints do not necessarily absolutely require an explanation. As much as I appreciate 40k's history at this point, previous history, for internal consistency, that does not mean that we can't have the occasional mystery, the occasional angel descended from up above that doesn't really need to be explained. God knows Diablo lost a lot of mystery when you were able to actually visit heaven. God, I hated that so much. So perhaps the living saints should simply be treated as our saints, as beings of inspiration and faith, rather than as creatures of hard, cold fact and reality. And perhaps looking for too much in the way of an explanation as to their existence would only serve to undermine the radiance of their glory. And I think we'll wrap it up right there. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.